In December 1872, a merchant ship was discovered drifting in the Atlantic Ocean. Its sails were still raised, its cargo was still in the hold, and the crew's belongings were still inside their cabins. But every person on board had vanished. No bodies, no lifeboat in sight, and no signs of violence. The ship had simply been abandoned in the middle of the ocean. The ship was called the Mary Celeste, and what happened to the 10 people aboard it remains one of the most intriguing maritime mysteries ever recorded. To understand how a perfectly seaworthy ship ended up drifting across the Atlantic with no crew, we have to go back to the beginning of the voyage. In early November 1872, the Mary Celeste departed from New York Harbour, bound for Genoa, Italy. The ship carried a cargo of industrial alcohol packed into more than 1,700 barrels. On board were 10 people: the captain, Benjamin Briggs, his wife, Sarah, their 2-year-old daughter, and 7 experienced crew members. Captain Briggs was an experienced sailor. He had spent most of his life at sea and had commanded several ships before taking charge of the Mary Celeste. Friends and colleagues described him as careful, disciplined, and deeply religious. He had built a reputation for avoiding unnecessary risks and for keeping both crew and ship safe, even during difficult voyages. The decision to bring his wife and young daughter along was unusual, but not totally unheard of. Families sometimes accompany captains on long journeys, particularly when the route was considered relatively safe. The rest of the crew were also experienced sailors who had worked similar routes before. By all accounts, the voyage should have been routine. Nearly a month later, on December the 4th, another merchant ship called the Dei Gratia spotted a vessel sailing erratically about 400 miles east off the Azores. The captain of the Dei Gratia, David Morehouse, noticed something unusual. The ship's sails were partially set, but its movement was irregular, as if no one were controlling it. When the crew approached closer, they recognised the vessel. It was the Mary Celeste, but something was clearly wrong. A small boarding party from the Dei Gratia climbed aboard the drifting vessel, and what they discovered only deepened the mystery. The ship itself was largely intact. There were no signs of a violent struggle and no evidence of piracy. The cargo remained in the hold, and the crew's personal belongings were still inside their cabins. Clothing hung where it had been left. Pipes, tools, and navigation charts remained on board, but the lifeboat was gone, and every person who had been aboard the Mary Celeste had completely disappeared. At this point, the situation made very little sense. The Mary Celeste was not badly damaged, and its cargo was still on board, and there was no sign that the crew had left in a hurry. Therefore, an experienced captain had abandoned a perfectly seaworthy ship in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. The question investigators would spend years asking was simple: what on earth had happened aboard the Mary Celeste? As investigators examined the vessel, they discovered several unusual clues. The ship's last logbook entry had been written 10 days earlier, placing the Mary Celeste hundreds of miles from where it was eventually discovered. This suggested the vessel had been drifting without a crew for more than a week. Several important navigation instruments were also missing, including the sextant and the marine chronometer. These tools were essential for determining a ship's position at sea, which suggested that whoever left the vessel may have intended to continue navigating from the lifeboat. Another detail caught investigators' attention. Several of the alcohol barrels in the cargo hold had leaked slightly during the voyage, and this leaking cargo may provide a possible explanation for what happened all those years ago. Industrial alcohol can provide highly flammable vapours when stored in large quantities inside a confined space, such as the cargo hold of a wooden ship. If those vapours began to build up beneath the deck, Captain Briggs may have feared that even a small spark could trigger an explosion. Some modern researchers believe he may have ordered the crew to temporarily abandon the ship as a precaution. The crew could have boarded the lifeboat while the ship ventilated, possibly tying the small boat to the Mary Celeste with a rope so they could return once the danger had passed. If that rope later snapped during rough seas, the lifeboat could have drifted away, leaving the larger ship to continue sailing alone. Without a crew to guide it, the Mary Celeste would have slowly wandered across the Atlantic until it was eventually discovered. When the Mary Celeste was brought to Gibraltar, a formal maritime inquiry was launched. Investigators carefully examined the ship for evidence of violence, mutiny or piracy. At one point, officials even suspected that the crew of the De Gratia might have staged the entire incident in order to claim salvage money. However, after months of investigation, no evidence supported that theory. The cargo was intact, the ship itself showed no signs of foul play, and in the end, the inquiry closed without a definitive explanation. Over time, the story of the Mary Celeste became even more mysterious. Newspapers began adding dramatic details, sometimes claiming that meals had been left half-eaten or that cups of tea were still warm when the ship was discovered. But these details were never recorded in the official investigation. However, they helped transform the story into maritime legend. Despite more than a century of speculation, the fate of the ship's passengers has never been confirmed. In the modern day, the disappearance of the Mary Celeste continues to fascinate historians because it sits in an uncomfortable space between explanation and mystery. The ship wasn't destroyed, and the cargo wasn't stolen, and the vessel itself was capable of sailing. Yet the people who had been aboard it simply vanished. Perhaps the answer lies in the chain of small events: fear of an explosion, a drifting lifeboat, and the unpredictable conditions of the Atlantic Ocean. Or perhaps the truth was lost with the 10 people who stepped into that small boat and were never seen again. What remains is a ship that sailed on without its crew, carrying with it one of the most enduring mysteries of the sea.